Yes, I think that good morning or good afternoon, depending on the place from which you connect. I think we can gradually start. I see that some people are still joining, but I think we can start to keep in line with the agenda. Welcome. My name is Alexander Śnigotsky. I represent Reform Institute. And this is an event organized in partnership between the Reform Institute and Climate Strategies. It's a part of our collaborative project Race to the Top for Climate, building a cooperative agenda for a globally interoperable clean economy transition. Today's agenda, you will see it on the next slide. So if we can move to the next slide, please. We start with the introduction with a word from the Environmental Defense Fund, whose support was crucial to make this project possible. Then I will present key findings from our final project report, and then we will move on to panel discussion, which will be hosted by Rati Davis from Lead It Secretariat. And we will also, during the panel, it will include Karin Addery from DG Climate, Lauren Stowe from US Department of Energy, and they will provide transatlantic perspectives on the topic of today's event. We'll also have Shuvaraha from CEEW, who will share her perspective on the international impacts of European and American cooperation in this field. And then we can proceed to Q&A session. And I would like to remind you that you will be able to post questions, comments in the chat, and we'll take them into account. And then there will be space for closing remarks, and we'll also inform you about the place when you can find the full report. And I'm seeing that there are some technical issues, and with some people joining the Teams invite, but I think that it's being gradually resolved. And let me just check if we already have Natasha on our call. It seems that it's not the case. So maybe a small adjustment to agenda, and maybe we can move on to the presentation of findings, and then later on I will give a word to Natasha Vidangos from EDF. So maybe we can move directly to the presentation of findings. Right, so when we have started the project, the goal was to address this, to look constructively at the current dynamic transatlantic and global race to introduce industrial decarbonization. And maybe we can move to next slide, please. So the context of the project is indeed very exciting. A lot of things are happening around the world. In the European Union, over the last year, we have seen proposed and implemented key elements of Green Deal Industrial Plan, especially Net Zero Industry Act, which in itself was to a significant extent reaction to what was happening in other parts of the world, especially the US, which introduced Inflation Reduction Act. And we cannot forget a strong push in China, its net zero pledge by 2060, and also sectoral transition policies, which also affect industry. So on first sight, it seems that there's a lot of positive momentum going on in different parts of the world, but at the same time, we see this positive dynamic creating its own risks, especially that the way which clean industry transitions are designed, and from the national, regional level, and what motivates them and affects the design is indeed industrial policies and strong component of this focus on national interests and promoting domestic industrial base, which is to a significant extent in conflict with the way in which industrial value chains are organized and in which the global progress on technologies and decarbonization may occur. So we wanted to reflect on how, especially in the European Union and in the US, the policy landscape and interlinkages between two regions can be organized in a way which would align this national level or European Union level initiatives in a way which indeed increases this pace of transition and avoids a kind of zero-sum game competition, which could actually hinder the transition on a global level. So we can move to the next slide, please. So the focus of the project was to have an analytical exercise, a deep look at how the European Union and US cooperate currently and how they can cooperate in the future on the topic of industrial decarbonization, and to develop recommendations, yes, how we can move forward with several key principles in mind. So first, it should be compatible with this domestic efforts to build clean economy. So this should be grounded in this national perspectives, in how different countries see view the way how they introduce climate policies. Second is to decarbonize industry, so actually to achieve this policy impact. It should be also mutually beneficial, so win-win solutions. And also, very importantly, look also beyond this transatlantic link to be connected with global transition, to leave space and support global efforts to decarbonize industry. So we can move to the next slide, please. Just a reminder that this was indeed an extensive team effort. We have both Reform Institute analytical team on board, but also climate strategies, which supported us with extensive exchanges with stakeholders, experts. We had a couple of stakeholder meetings, many bilateral events. So today I'm presenting just the highlights from quite extensive study, but you will find the main documents covering quite a lot of insights which we gathered through the project. And we can move on to the next slide, please. So when we started this task, we needed to organize a very extensive set of information about different policies, transatlantic links, to find a way forward. And I think that we can move on to the next slide. Yes, so there is the analytical framework which we introduced was dynamic policy mix. So basically looking at different policy instruments which, when combined, gradually move on the clean solutions from this early stage when they're early technologies were costly. It's quite difficult to switch from conventional to clean solutions to this clean alternatives. So usually starting, the support with quite intensive part, and then moving gradually to scaling up the market with marginal costs of switching to the technologies decrease. And over a longer term, you can move on to the clean solution as a standard. So indeed, you can also see that these types of policies are grouped in a supply push type of policy, which are typically occur early on in the process. You also have demand pull, which focusing on creating demand for solutions or ensuring that demand is there by introducing, for instance, standards, and they typically cluster closer to the ends of the cycle. You also have cross-cutting price signal, which act effectively between the two. They deliver the scale-up and broad transition to clean economy. And then we have systemic enablers such as sustainable finance or supporting just transition to kind of close the whole process. So this was important, will be important, as you will see when assessing how we can move forward. So we shouldn't focus only on one initiative or one type of policy. We should look at this dynamically. So we can move forward. Just several quick observations on current state. So obviously, a lot of activities on the transatlantic stage were driven in recent years by GASA, Global Arrangement on Sustainable Steel and Aluminium, and discussions around next steps after IRA was introduced, such as critical minerals agreement between the US and European Union. And in both of this process, we have seen that this was indeed a very challenging scope or place for a transatlantic cooperation. In GASA, it's essentially very different philosophies, institutional frameworks, approaches to carbon pricing on both sides of Atlantic, and effectively the process has stalled recently. And if you think about how the very broad support from tax credits works for clean technology, you can say that this is to some extent also a very broad price signal, but going other way around. So just supporting the clean solutions, but it also requires both sides to agree on how to apply this broad price signal to the products which are imported from the other party. And in both cases, it proves to be a very difficult task indeed. And more interestingly, on the more international, multilateral stage, we have seen the climate club concept going from very much focused on carbon pricing to a much broader and inclusive forum for policy exchanges. So overall, wherever you look, this cooperation or strong linkages on price signals appears to be quite challenging. However, and we can move to the next slide, we have seen that there's a lot of things happening beyond these discussions, difficult discussions on carbon pricing. And if you look at the activities, you have high-level exchanges between both US and European Union as in TTC, but also numerous other initiatives which focus on policies which deliver supply push and demand pull, and also provides the systemic enablers. So even though this very much publicized initiatives focused mostly on carbon price signal have faced difficulties, there's already a lot to build on in other areas. This is quite important given the current state of play and moving forward. So if we can move to next slide, please. So what we have done afterwards, after looking at current state of linkages, we have reviewed policy landscape in both European Union and the US and connected this to existing links. So this was quite an extensive work for each type of policy instrument. But this review of instruments has allowed us to synthesize the assessment of current state and perspectives for improvement. So you can see example of R&D support programs here, and on the next slide you can see an example of our assessment for this type of instrument. If we can move to the next slide, please. For the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. So for instance, for R&D, we see the current state, we assess it as good, but also the potential for improvement. We see numerous alleys for improvement. And then if you come back to this dynamic policy mix, you can see that there is a broader picture emerging, and we can move to the next slide. So these are cross-cutting instruments which form this kind of picture with very different current states, but also very different improvement potentials. But there's emerging overall conclusion, and you can see it on the next slide. So that we have indeed challenging cooperation on agreeing how to have a very consistent price signal approach, be it carbon tax, emission allowance system, or indeed a very broad, comprehensive set of tax credits promoting clean technologies. But at the same time, if you look earlier and later in the process, there's indeed quite a lot of space for improvement and existing platforms which can deliver this work. So for supply push, cooperation on research and development, also potential to align more on sectoral subsidies or first of a kind support, but also then looking on demand pool, when we have seen common themes emerging in defining, for instance, what is clean steel, what is clean cement, either for public procurement, for voluntary schemes, but also in the longer term discussions on standards or requirements for broader market, quite in a similar way, which can be seen in other sectors, for instance, in vehicles, when different countries declare targets to move on to zero emission vehicles by some date, without necessarily discussing how to carbon price the fuels, or how to align in big detail on tax credits for clean vehicles. And we also present these examples in the report. So it seems that kind of redirection of focus of effort to this other parts of policy mix can help bridge this gap which we have in the middle on price signals. And if we can move to next slide, we have also looked at the different technology-specific opportunities for cooperation. And here, indeed, we also find some interesting examples, and especially also which can be applied for supply push and demand pull, such as for instance, in circular economy or industrial electrification, we see that this type of more systemic shifts, we know that they are important. They have potential to unlock the industrial decarbonization, but at the same time, they for now are largely overlooked as an opportunity for cooperation between US and European Union. And at the same time, we also see that in other technological areas, such as hydrogen, CCS, or CCU, there is more activity going on. But we would argue that we need to particularly focus on some areas which maybe not necessarily have gathered that much attention in recent years, just because they're so broad and they require more systemic shift. And maybe we can move to the final slide. So we won't go through every single recommendation which we covered in the report, but you will find in the full publication a set of recommendations which indeed follow this logic of first strengthening and expanding existing linkages, which, as I have shown earlier, are already quite broad, and then adding additional elements or adding additional initiatives which then further expand transatlantic linkages. So we stay in this logic of building, expanding something which already exists, and only adding new initiatives where we see that there's indeed a complete gap, which is not in many cases actually true. So I think to summarize, we would argue that there is significant potential for further cooperation moving forward, with two main conclusions: that shifting focus maybe a bit away from carbon pricing and similar policies to other parts of policy mix, and shifting attention to more systemic shifts in technologies and organization of the whole flow of industrial value chains would be beneficial both for transatlantic cooperation, but also would be inclusive for other parts of the world, supporting global transition. With that, I would like to maybe come back to the agenda point which we have missed. So to the word from the Environmental Defense Fund, and Natasha Vidangos, who is Associate Vice President for Innovation and Technology Policy at EDF. The whole project was made possible through the extensive support and guidance over the past year. So Natasha, the floor is yours.
Perfect. I'll just be very, very brief because I do want to get straight to the results. I just want to welcome you all and say thank you to the Reform and Climate Strategies team. This was really a very challenging project, and one where we approached it from basically the conundrum that on one hand, we live in a world where we desperately need to address climate change, and industrial decarbonization is a prerogative that needs a lot more work and a lot more help. And living in a global society with supply chains that crisscross the world and with intersecting needs and priorities, working together is going to be important. The other part of this conundrum is that we live in a political world, and we need to be able to work with the politics that we have. And right now we're in a moment where a lot of areas in the world, including the EU and the United States, are doubling down a bit on focusing how they deliver benefit to their own communities and to their own citizens. So this gives us an area of challenge. And we basically gave Reform and Climate Strategies the question of, how do you navigate this? How can you find areas of constructive, productive engagement in the middle? And we know that some areas are particularly challenging in the spaces of trade, in the spaces of carbon markets. There is great work that's been done in that space, but it can be very difficult to come to agreements. But we knew that there is more to it than that. So we gave them a very, very wide field, a very wide area of engagement to look through. They've done a tremendous amount of work in exploring all of the different kinds of policy mechanisms, regulatory frameworks, diplomatic engagements, to try to help flush out those areas where there is still more room for us to work together. So we're very grateful also to everybody out in the community who gave us feedback on this report and the work that went into it. Many people here did. So thank you for your time and your engagement. And we hope it creates useful information that we can use to take forward. So we look forward to working with you all on it. And thanks to the team.
Thank you very much. And we can come back to the pre-programmed agenda. So we're back to the, I would also like to maybe, I would like to give word to Arati Davis from Leaded Secretariat, and we can move on to the panel.
Sure, I'm just going to give a really quick introduction. I think, Natasha, the words that you put forward are really kind of the world we live in. I am currently the head of business development for Lead It. Lead It is a global public-private platform that was created in 2019 at the UN Action and Climate Summit. And it's chaired currently with India and Sweden, but we have 18 member countries and 22 industry partners. These industry partners have been growing month on month. So really, in response to the report, it's not a question of why, it's really a question of how. And some of the kind of reactions I've had on behalf of Lead IT is that the report touches upon, and Alex, I'm going to come to what you showed us, SWOT analysis. And really what we need to see from the industry side is this demand pull that you talk about, because we have a lot of front runner companies that are stepping up who are saying that there is a regulatory incentive in the EU and the US to develop these technologies, but now we need the demand pull to go across geographies and across markets. And that is a question of a just transition. How do we level this playing field? And technology and finance become critical door openers for us. So we're really interested to see how we can kind of work with some of the things that you've highlighted in the report. And it really points to some of the challenges that we've felt over the last few years. So really interesting to be here. Thank you to Climate Strategies Inter-Reform to be part of this conversation. Really happy to have our expert panelists take this apart for us and kind of give us feedback and their reactions and maybe give us a way forward. So with that, I want to introduce our panelists. Please open your cameras or unmask yourselves. So here we have Shiva Raha, Fellow and Lead in International Cooperation, CEW, Council on Energy, Environment and Water. We have Lauren Stowe, Director, International Market Development, US Department of Energy. And Caroline Edgery should be with us as well. There you are, but not unmasked just yet. Great to have you with us. Head of Unit and Bilateral Relations, European Commission, DG Climate. So what we're going to do right now is I'm going to ask each of you to kind of provide your reactions to the report and the presentation that we just heard. And then, of course, we'll open up to the audience who've been part of this discussion and also have reactions and questions to you. Carol, I'd like to start with you.
Yes, hello. Good afternoon. Thank you for inviting us, DG Klima, to this event. And I would like, first of all, to congratulate really the Reform Institute and all the people who have been working on this extremely well-informed report. That also opens a bit avenues and has a broader vision than what we are usually, focusing on. And I think it's very good. So I have circulated it around in DG Klima at a moment when, we have to prepare now for a new commission and then a new policy development, but mostly in the current framework of our Green Deal. So thanks again for this very informative report. I think it's good to de-zoom from time to time and then look at what works and what doesn't work. Of course, it's the opinion of the drafters of the report, but I must say it's very useful because indeed our starting point as EU is the Green Deal and what we call in our jargon the Fit for 55 framework, which is in fact was aiming at enhancing our policies for carbon pricing, so enhancing our emission trading system, but also putting forward clear policies to support industrial decarbonization and development of green technology. And now what we see is that we have sort of the framework with what we call the Net Zero Industry Act. But now we need to give a little push to make things become a reality. And that's what our president announced with the Clean Industrial Deal. You will not be surprised when I say that as far as it goes with our current system of carbon pricing and emission trading system, we managed to reduce our emissions by 32.5% since 1990 as of 2022. So we firmly believe that for the EU, it was the most efficient way of reducing our emissions while collecting revenue to finance the transition, but also while keeping our industry, our economy growing, because in the meantime, the GDP of the EU has grown by 67%. So for us, there is really a business case for this. But as I said, this is not enough. And that's why we have now to dedicate more efforts to greening and cleaning the industrial policy. Of course, based on that, these achievements for us, international cooperation is very important because we represent around 7% of global emissions in the EU at the moment, direct emissions. So we see the need to engage with other countries, high emitters, countries that are still high emitters, or those that are developing fast and then whose emissions are increasing. Without forgetting also the agenda on adaptation, because that's also an area where we will need to do more and engage more. So when it comes to industrial decarbonization, the report shows very well all the different initiatives. I think the slide 10 in the presentation is very telling about, okay, we all jumped on something and have our initiatives, but indeed, how do we ensure that we all go in the same direction or that it brings this value added, that we get the industry jumping on it, making the investments, and then create this demand that was mentioned by Shova. And here I must say that we need the input of industry to tell us, a bit, okay, they have the framework, this is how we digested it, and then this is where we would like to go and are ready to go. And for me, so far, we have had this close cooperation with the US, and you mentioned the TTC, and we had also the negotiations on the global arrangement for steel and aluminium. We had the clean energy incentives dialogue. So we had several fora, and now I think it would be useful that we put, let's say, we put our heads together and see a bit how we help rationalize all the multilateral initiatives. One which is very interesting and I see really taking up is the Climate Club. It was mentioned in your report as well. I think now there's quite a critical mass of countries that are interested, and in particular this matchmaking part. So I think it's something we are really investing in. Because then it offers this space for conversation and then action on the different aspects of the decarbonization agenda. But obviously, once we have a new commission in place, once we have a new administration in place in the US, it will be important for us to continue to exchange and work together to address all the challenges of decarbonization and try to have some converging programs and converging policies, and also how we can leverage this in our cooperation with other countries. And finally, a critical moment will be also our nationally determined contributions, which is where all parties to the Paris Agreement will announce a target of reductions by 2035, but also what policies we will put to implement them, and also what investment agenda do we attach to it. And that's very important also for us as a starting point for the conversation, because it's where we will see how countries position themselves in this global economy. Thank you.
Karen, I'm going to ask you a quick question, because you made the case very clearly, the business case, if we're actually building this conversation on transition. You talk about the investments into the EU and how the EU has grown in the last 5 years since this has happened. And you, of course, touch upon TTC gas and the different platforms that have been created to, in their own ways, incentivize this dialogue. I want to ask you just one thing. What would you say as we go forward as a critical element of gaps that we've seen on these platforms, and how can we look to close the gap in the next steps that we take? Again, it's an interesting year, 2024. We've got a lot happening geopolitically, internationally. What should these platforms, multinational, multi-stakeholder, look to have in mind as we go forward, looking with industry from a policy perspective on closing the gap, actually, when it comes to decarbonization?
Well, I think there are several, these different initiatives are, let's say, struggling around 2-3 key topics. The first of all is how we have methodologies for determining the carbon intensity or embedded carbon content of products. So here I think it's quite a recent work stream, but I think we're all struggling around this. But in the EU, we have our methodology and our legislation, so for us it's quite easy. But then how do we at the international level find, let's say, generally acceptable methodologies? The other aspect is, I guess, for industry, it's important to see also what are the applicable standards, and how we facilitate the trade in these new products, green technologies and products. So how do we make our production rules compatible with each other so that we can continue to trade? And of course, the investment and the finance part. How do we then make sure that we have the necessary investments that are needed, not only in Europe, not only in the US, but also in third countries?
Absolutely. So it comes back to interoperability and kind of how do we level this playing field? Lauren, I want to come to you now. We've heard from the EU. Coming to the US, what are your feedbacks to what you've heard today, and what should we be thinking about as we go forward? I also want to say to the audience, if you have questions, feel free to start putting them in the chat. We will come to them in the Q&A after this.
Yeah, thank you very much. I first just want to say thank you so much for the invitation to participate today with these esteemed panelists. It's wonderful to be with you all. And also for this work, the the body of work that is coming out of all of this thinking and the analytics of pulling together so many different threads of the various ways that we have opportunities to collaborate is incredibly helpful from where I sit. So just to clarify a little bit about my perch within the US government, it's a bit different from Caroline. So I am in the US Department of Energy. I am the lead for international market development here. So casting our gaze for a very domestic facing agency to how we better connect and interconnect with supply chains and international markets. I do want to say about this body of work and the results that have been presented today that I think it's an excellent illustration of the very complex policymaking landscape that we find ourselves in today. Maybe more complex than ever before, because all of these different products across the entire economy with distinct supply chains and distinct needs need to be decarbonized. And we need to be able to find a way to continue to grow economically globally, not just at home, but with partners around the globe. And decarbonize and protect our national security. It's very complex. Most importantly, I think from our perspective at the Department of Energy, we are trying to be business-led and government supportive of this clean industrial transition. And that means that we are in constant communication with US industry, but also with international industry to try to understand this very rapidly changing landscape of how supply chains are affected based on different shipping concerns. You know, we might be talking about a supply chain for one product, but it turns out that the shipping fuel that's available in Singapore is the limiting factor. So we have to be able to pivot and be flexible in our policymaking. One of the things that I was asked to focus on is what do I see as being potentially some of the more durable spaces for continued collaboration, given the political changes, both in the US and in the EU. So from where I sit in the US, I see a tremendous amount of bipartisan support for work in two particular areas. One is in the trade and supply of critical minerals for energy purposes, or critical energy minerals. And the other is in finding some way to create an interoperable border measure system that enables countries around the globe to participate and benefit from incentives towards driving industrial emissions down. So in these two spaces, the Department of Energy is currently already has work underway. So a couple of things just to flag, coming out of the US government-wide task force on climate and trade that was announced earlier this year. It was announced this week at Climate Week that we're moving forward with a pilot project to develop a USG approach to measurement of embedded emissions in traded goods. This pilot will start in steel and aluminum. And the Department of Energy is actually leading this work because we're working very closely with our labs who have some of the most advanced research on life cycle analysis and can do really the modeling work needed to figure out what is the least common denominator approach that would enable us to also anticipate the overall, the product specific emissions from production in a foreign country that may not have all of the data gathered that the US and the EU have gathered. So this is one of our big data gaps that we're trying to resolve. I don't think anyone has fixed that yet. We also have a wide array of research and development going on right now, recently announced for conversion of carbon dioxide emissions into environmentally responsible and economically valuable products. This is a US approach to putting a dollar value on transformed carbon emissions. I think as many folks know, there is pretty much no political pathway to a carbon price in the US right now. So we are looking for as many creative ways as possible to understand from a performance-based perspective. We can all measure it. So from a performance-based perspective, how are we driving down emissions? A couple of other things just to share. We are continuing our industrial training and assessment centers expansion, which comes out of the bipartisan infrastructure bill in the US of 2022. So that will continue no matter what happens going forward. That is a massive effort to increase our skills base in the clean energy manufacturing, mining spaces, all of the various skill areas where we need a workforce to be able to move all of this forward. So those are, that's just sort of a handful of the measures that are happening in the US. In terms of the soft cooperation that's mentioned in the report, I do think that finding an approach that is interoperable, not just amongst the US and the EU, but I think the US and the EU can be leaders in this, where we don't all have to have the same legal framework, but we can have a common approach to at least translating how we're measuring embedded carbon in traded goods, so that our systems can talk to each other and we can have the most successful incentives with the clearest market signals.
Lauren, thank you so much. I mean, I think our next speaker will have a lot to kind of mirror what you're saying, because of course, when it comes to carbon markets, that is a difficult question sometimes, and that's a difficult question to address. And rather than shy away from dealing with it, how do you actually navigate these complexities? And of course, like you very openly said, this is a complexity that you need to kind of handle face on, head first. I think, of course, also at New York Climate Week, the US signed an energy partnership with India, and we have Shiva Raha now speaking next to give us kind of this third country perspective on some of the conversations we need to be having when it comes to industrial transition and, in this case, kind of interoperability. Shiva, over to you.
Thanks, Aarti, and thanks for being here. What I love about the Reform and Climate Strategies report is that they're pragmatic. We have certain truths in there that we often kind of just sweep under the carpet. So that kind of allows us to have a frank conversation, at least from a foundation of honesty. So I want to comment on 4 points over here because we're outside looking in. That said, I work very closely with colleagues in the US DOE. We have a team from DG Klima coming over to our office sometime in early October. So these are very, very active conversations. But like Natasha said, and I quote, we live in a political world. And as the head of international cooperation, my work is at the crux of policy and politics, and there's some technology thrown in. So I'm going to sort of speak not just of India, but the global South as a whole that's basketed EMDs, as we call it. My first point would be that it's not a homogeneous mix. So unlike the EU, it's not an economic zone. It doesn't have similarities of that sort. And unlike the US, these are mostly not behemoth countries if you take out China and India from that equation. And a lot of that is due to population size and not so much the economic weight that they carry. What's happening in these countries is more than an energy transition, we're undergoing an economic transformation, right? Because we are trying to become developed. So the priority itself is very different on what we're trying to do. In that, if you see something like in India, with 1.5 billion people, we have been independent for only 75 years. We're trying to kind of become developed by 2047, which is 100 years of independence, on a low carbon pathway. And this is not a posture because we import more than $100 billion of oil and natural gas a year, and it would serve us to not be doing that, even from an energy security point of view, not just a transition point of view. But what we've also seen, and India was a closed economy till the 90s, so too much regulation, too much licensing, and we had a phrase called license Raj, which means the reign of the license. And it completely scuttled our industry till India actually went bankrupt and had to open up its economy in 1991. So one thing I would guard against when we bring in so much things where we're entirely trying to micro-regulate value chains is choking industry altogether, especially when you think that in India, for example, we have 63.5 million MSMEs. These are small businesses that are not big businesses, don't have the wherewithal to really comply with, like the 17 or 18 global country rules, forget our national rules, state rules. district level rules and so on and so forth. So I'm going to right off the bat say there's a risk of bringing it down the value chain, because I think both everybody's spoken of the value chain and the supply chain and the interoperability complexity over here. The second point I want to sort of say, because we led with the IRA and the EU Green Deal being these sustainable signals, but from our point of view, these are protectionist measures, because it seems to us, because these are such large amounts given by powerful countries, that they have sucked out investment from India. So Indian companies are now investing in the US because it's so much more lucrative to do that. And so our green transition is sort of coming to a complete halt because we don't have liquidity. And so we have something like $2 billion invested by Indian companies in the US versus 200 million by the DFC in India. So this is going to become very quickly a problem, because we do not have the kind of deep pockets to sustain against a $300 billion SOPs given to a country. Same goes for the EU Green Deal. So we need to look at this. And this kind of plays into how we see the JETP. India did not sign up to the JETP, a lot of controversy over there. But when certain things are structured, if EU and US want to be a player in the global scenario, they'll have to see the impact of that on the countries that are on the other side that they would like to work with, and the impact on them, and not just operate unilaterally between themselves, I would say, because then they're alienating the people they would want to work with. And then, of course, I'm not going to go too deep into the technology finance issues, because we do not have that flowing, as everybody knows. I'm not going to go on to that. I want to go on a bigger point, which is a political point that Natasha kind of touched upon, where we see sort of a lot of political risks in getting into long-term clean energy transactions with the US and the EU, where there's a lot of political posturing on the positions on sustainability, unlike in the global south or EMDs, as we say, where, let's say, President Trump comes in versus the Democrats coming in, there seems to be a lot of difference in the strategy that US would take. We don't know if that would translate into something that impacts a 25-year transition of the steel industry, for example, if we embark upon that. So where does it stop being transactional to where does it become a long-term strategic partnership that is not sort of dependent on political sanctions? Because you have to understand we're the receiving end of all of these things. So let's say something happens between the US and Russia, and then India becomes kind of in the middle of that, that endangers our economic and a transition that will apply to any other global south country. The final point I would like to make is there are the global free market also matters. So there are other players. So the Middle East exists. There's the South American market, the African market, the Southeast Asian market. China itself is like this huge thing that is happening. Russia also is up in a power position, if you see from the global South point of view. So if we do not sort of have these countries of the EMDs be a part of US-EU roadmap, then there can be an alternate rules-based order. There can be an alternate market, because these people are in play. They're not alien to people who are outside that ecosystem. So then whether we look at the role of the G20, the Quad, the IPEF, the BRICS, there's so many regional and subnational strategic partnerships, which is different from the UN partnerships that we have. And what are the impacts of those? They also need to be taken into account, because when you're talking taxonomy, or talking technology exchange, you're talking energy security, which then goes into defense security and national security and things like that. It's bigger than just trading of goods, and it's bigger than just ships arriving at ports and measuring those things. So I'm going to kind of close with that, Arti.
Shiva, I don't know if you need to answer some. I'm going to ask you some questions because you raise a lot that I think we would also need to unpack a little bit. And so I'd like to just unpack one of those, because India, of course, now in the case of Lead It, is a main player. The country and the prime minister stood up at COP28 and said, we want to go forward, and we want to go forward together. So the spirit of collaboration, of course, is deeply embedded. We're seeing companies, the front runner companies in India, signing up month on month. So there is kind of an engagement strategy that seems to be very clear. But like you say, it has to be top to bottom. It has to be accessible to all. And I'm glad you mentioned the word pragmatic. That's exactly it. What we can do right here is have that pragmatic discussion. Now, you raised a lot of questions about kind of what the US is doing, what the EU is doing. What is your message to the audience today and to us sitting on the panel in terms of how we should move things forward? If you were to say to choose one area that you touched upon, what should we be looking at?
I would look at the long-term aspect of this. This is not a short-term. So if you're looking at the race to the top, it's like a marathon to the top, if you will. So a race is competitive. So we need to see what we're doing over here, because we're looking at, for example, becoming a developed society by 2047, our net zero is 27. These are long haul things. And if we get it wrong right now, if we get the partnerships wrong, if we get the technologies wrong, then we are nowhere in 2050. We cannot fix for that right now. So the conversations right now cannot be prescriptive. It has to be a little more exploratory. And that would be, and this is why I respect this particular presentation, because that went beyond the usual homilies that we say that we need to do this and that, to really what are the gaps, where are the gaps, and a lot of conversation. And I think certain things have to be apolitical. We have to come to, it's easy to say, I know it's not easy to, we are a democracy. So we have a country behavior that based on, people reacting to situations. So the political messaging becomes very, very important. Prime Minister Modi has consistently talked of climate change. It's not a partisan issue in India anywhere. Our opposition is not against it. So, but if we're going to get into, like, let's say the Critical Minerals Act, where India is a member of the Critical Minerals Act, which is the only developing country in that agreement, where are we taking that? How are we working that out politically? Is there a risk at some point that the US and EU say, okay, you are not playing ball with us, India, unless you align with us in a certain way, we will kind of put a sanction on that. It happened with our nuclear proliferation deal and so on and so forth. So there is precedence.
But I
to
think,
some
Shiva,
things
that's
happening.
great. I think we've actually
Yeah.
heard similar words across the different panelists in terms of bipartisan, in terms of working with practical kind of pivoting mentalities. We need to be flexible, and we need to actually find that common ground where we can all move forward together. So it's interesting that in very kind of different ways, there's been a similarity in the conversation here with all the panelists, which is a great sign that the report has actually kind of engendered that conversation to say, in some ways, we're on the same page here, and how do we actually create these strategies to move forward? We have only a few minutes left, so I'm going to open it up to the audience for questions. I don't seem to be able to see the questions on my screen, so if there are questions, please unmic yourself and shout them out. I think everything's been very clear, which happens when it's a good presentation, a good conversation, a few questions. But then we are exactly on time with those questions. And Alex, I'll hand it back to you for the closing remarks. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, and thank you very much for kind words about our work. So I have to provide some closing remarks, and indeed, I think I note that there is indeed this topic of agreeing on what is low carbon steel or carbon cement, what I think both sides of Atlantic mentioned, that it also takes time, and I think it also will be some discussion and maybe sometimes also some political decisions. But I think that we should not also discount this kind of importance just of providing a systemic discussion and just providing a kind of policy choice which we are facing. I think that in the recent years we have seen very similar discussions happening just on a bit couple of years later in the US compared to what was happening in the European Union, for instance, on how to define green hydrogen. All the same challenges, but just occurring in parallel spaces and facing the same kind of questions, dilemmas, with no single good answer. But maybe it would make sense to care a bit more about informing ourselves, maybe looking together at this kind of space of choices which we have. Maybe we will, in the end, choose a bit different answers or parameters, but at least we'll have a kind of understanding where are the differences and from what they stem. So it would be much easier than in the longer term to arrive at the same broad clean industrial standards in each of sectors. So my second thought from the whole project and for all the conversations is indeed that there is another one, like a gap in exchanges and knowledge, but there's a lot of in-depth work on the national policy mixes, on this kind of interactions between different policies and how to design kind of national systems. And there's a lot of work on the connections, but not necessarily, you don't necessarily have many people who think about indeed designing a system of connections, because these are like two separate areas of specialization. So maybe also this is something which would be useful to be attentive to explore further moving forward, to also think in a systemic way about how we connect different geographies, both US, European Union, but also globally, not only on a specific initiative, specific questions, but also what ecosystem we have to deliver transition on for each sector. Do we have enough? And if we have some specific problems, specific very difficult questions which we see take time or are stalling, what we can do once again systemically to close these gaps by focusing more on different types of common systems, common initiatives. So with that, I would like once again to thank everyone who joined, who find time today to join the discussion. I would like to thank panelists. It's an excellent discussion covering these different aspects. I would like to thank Climate Strategies team, and also once again thank EDF for their support. And then just a technical reminder, you will be able to find the report and the summary on the webpage, on the Climate Strategies webpage, and you also find it on our webpage, Reform Institute. And I think that you will also see more details on the panelists also on the webpage by Climate Strategies. Ines, do you have anything else to add?
All good. I would just like to maybe thank everyone for attending and for the wonderful presentation. And yes, as mentioned by Alex, the report will be made available and shared directly to you tomorrow morning. Many thanks.
Thank you very much, and have a nice late morning, late afternoon, or maybe even evening. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.